The colonel's hands went completely still the moment I set the coin on the table. He had been reaching for his coffee, mid-sentence, talking to the man beside him about something I wasn't following. Then his eyes dropped to that small brass disc, and everything stopped. The room around us, folding chairs, paper tablecloths, a banner that read "Welcome Home Veterans" in red and blue seemed to hold its breath. He didn't pick it up right away. He just stared at it the way you stare at something you weren't supposed to see again. "Where did you get this?" he asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, but his hands weren't moving anymore. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away 6 weeks ago." The colonel looked up at me for the first time. Really looked at me. Not at my uniform, not at the coin. At my face. "What was his name?" "Walter Briggs," I said. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "We need to speak privately." And that was the moment I understood that my grandfather, the man my own family had spent 30 years dismissing, had never been who any of us thought he was. My grandfather, Walter Briggs, lived in a small house in eastern Tennessee, just outside a town called Maynardville. Population just under 3,000. The kind of town where everybody knew your truck and nobody asked too many questions. He had a long porch that sagged slightly on the left side, a garden that grew better tomatoes than anyone could explain, and a 1,987 Ford pickup that he kept running through what I can only describe as stubbornness and mechanical intuition. He did not own a computer. He did not have a smartphone. He had a landline telephone on the kitchen wall and a radio he kept tuned to a weather station. He was not dramatic. He was not complicated, or at least that was what my family always said. They said he was simple. They said it like it was a kind word. It wasn't. My mother grew up embarrassed by him. She moved away from Maynardville at 22 and never really came back. She married my father, who worked in insurance in Nashville, and they built a life that looked nothing like the one she grew up in. Nice neighborhood. New cars. A Christmas card photo every year with everyone smiling at the right angle. Grandfather was not on the card. He was invited once, I think, when I was very young. He didn't fit. To my parents, he was a reminder of something they had decided not to be. He had no money to speak of. He asked for nothing, which they somehow interpreted as having nothing to offer. My mother called him peculiar. My father called him withdrawn. My brother, who was 4 years older than me and seemed to inherit my parents' talent for efficient dismissal, called him boring. I called him Grandpa Walt. I called him that until the day he died. He served in Vietnam. I knew that much. There were discharge papers in a folder in his desk drawer, the kind of brown folder that gets soft around the edges after decades. But there were no photos of him in uniform, no medals on the wall, no stories over dinner. When I asked him once, I was maybe 14, he looked out at the garden for a long moment and said, "Some things are better left where they happened." Then he handed me a glass of sweet tea and changed the subject to whether I thought the Cardinals had a shot that year. I stopped asking. Everybody in my family had stopped asking long before I did. When I enlisted in the Army at 22, my parents were worried in the practical way: deployment, danger, career trajectory. My grandfather drove 4 hours to my graduation from basic training. He stood in the bleachers in his good shirt, the blue one with the snaps instead of buttons, and he didn't cheer loudly or wave a flag. He just watched. When I found him afterward in the crowd, his eyes were wet, and he gripped my hand with both of his and said, "You'll do fine. You already know how." I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was just being kind. My parents came to that graduation too, but they left early. My father had a tea time. My mother had a thing in the morning. For the next 7 years, I stayed close to Grandpa Walt the way you stay close to something true when everything else starts to feel uncertain. I called him every Sunday. I drove down to Maynardville when I had leave. We'd sit on that sagging porch and drink coffee and watch the road. He never asked me about my work in detail, and I never pushed him about his. There was an unspoken agreement between us. Some things you carry quietly. He started getting sick 2 years before he died. Nothing dramatic, a slow accumulation of small things. His back, his lungs, the kind of tired that doesn't go away after a night of sleep. I asked him once if he'd seen a doctor, and he said he had seen enough of them in his life for one lifetime. I tried to get my mother to check in on him. She said she would. She didn't. I tried my brother. He said Maynardville was 4 hours and he had the kids' soccer schedule. I called the neighbor across the street, a retired woman named Mrs. Patton, and asked her to knock on his door every few days. She was the one who called me when the time came. It was a Tuesday in November. I was stationed in Georgia. Mrs. Patton called my cell and said she hadn't seen the kitchen light come on for 2 mornings. She'd knocked. He'd answered, but he could barely get to the door. I was in the car within 40 minutes. I called my mother on the way. She said she hoped he'd be all right and asked if I needed her to do anything. I said he needed someone to be there. She said she had a dentist appointment Thursday and she'd see how things looked. When I got to Maynardville, Grandpa Walt was sitting in his kitchen chair, and he knew what was happening. You could see it in the way he wasn't fighting it anymore. I got him to the hospital in Knoxville, and the doctors used words I had learned to understand in the Army deterioration, comfort measures, timeline. I held his hand for most of those 2 days. I slept in the chair beside his bed. My parents did not come. My brother sent a text that said, "Thinking of you both. Crazy week over here." On the second afternoon, Grandpa Walt opened his eyes and found my face and said, very quietly, "You were always the one who paid attention." I told him to stop talking like that. I told him he needed to rest. He smiled in the way old men smile when they know more than you do. He died that evening, peacefully, with his hand in mine and nobody else in the room. When I called my mother, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was ready, I think." I did not respond to that. I put the phone down and sat in the parking lot of the hospital for a long time, watching car headlights move through the dark. I handled the funeral myself, a small service at the church he had attended occasionally but never made a fuss about. 7 people total. Me, Mrs. Patton, 2 men from the VFW post in town who had known him for years but couldn't tell me much about how, the pastor, a woman from his church who brought a casserole, and a man who appeared at the back of the room and introduced himself only as an old friend. He didn't say from where or when. He left before I could ask him anything. My parents sent flowers. My brother did not come. My mother called it a long drive for something so small. Something so small. I went back to his house after the service to go through his things. The practical work of grief boxes, decisions, the strange intimacy of touching someone's daily objects after they're gone. His kitchen smelled like him. I stood in it for a while before I could start. Most of it was ordinary. Clothes in good condition, kept long past fashion. His radio. Toolboxes in the garage that were organized with a precision that still surprised me. A shelf of Louis L'Amour paperbacks. VHS tapes of old westerns. In the back of his bedroom closet, inside an old shoebox under a folded flannel shirt, I found the coin. It was about the size of a silver dollar. Heavier than it looked. Brass, darkened with age, with a clean edge that suggested it had once been stored carefully. On one side there was an eagle, not the standard military eagle. Something slightly different, wings down instead of spread, head turned at an angle I didn't recognize from any insignia I'd ever studied. On the other side, a sequence of numbers and a small emblem that looked almost like a compass rose but wasn't quite. No branch name, no motto, no year. I had never seen it before. I did not remember him wearing it or carrying it. It had been hidden in a shoebox under a flannel shirt in a closet he knew I would eventually search. I turned it over in my hands for a long time. Then I put it in my jacket pocket, and I kept it there. My family didn't ask about it. They didn't ask about anything. My mother called once to ask about the house, whether I was planning to sell it or whether she should contact someone. I said I would handle it. She seemed relieved. 3 weeks later, I was assigned to attend a regional veterans recognition ceremony in Knoxville, the kind of event that happens every year in every mid-sized American city speeches. A color guard, older men in garrison caps sitting in the front rows with their wives, tables with donated food, a banner. I went in uniform because that was appropriate. I wore the coin in my left jacket pocket because I had started doing that without quite deciding to. The hall was warm and crowded. I moved through it the way you move through these events, handshakes, nods, brief conversations. I found a seat and listened to a city councilman give a speech about sacrifice that was sincere but not specific. During the reception afterward, I ended up at a table near the back. A man sat down across from me, older, mid-70s I thought, with the kind of bearing that didn't require a uniform to be visible. He introduced himself as Colonel Harlan Pruitt, retired. We talked briefly about nothing in particular, the way you talk at these events. Then I reached into my pocket for my phone, and the coin came out with it and landed on the table between us. That was when he went still. He stared at it for a long moment without speaking. The conversation he'd been having with the man beside him simply stopped. His coffee cup remained in midair. Then he looked at me the way I described, and he asked where I got it. And I told him it was my grandfather's. And he asked for his name. And I told him Walter Briggs. And the colonel closed his eyes for 3 seconds and said we needed to speak privately. We went to a small side room off the main hall. He closed the door. The sounds of the ceremony became muffled applause, someone laughing, a microphone being adjusted. In the room there were 2 plastic chairs and a folding table and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. He sat down slowly. I sat across from him. The coin was in my hand. "How much did he tell you?" the colonel asked. "Nothing," I said. "He never talked about his service." The colonel nodded as if that was the answer he expected. "That sounds like Walt," he said quietly. "You knew him," I said. "I served alongside him." "Not for long, but long enough." He paused. "You're in the army." "Yes, sir." "Intelligence?" I hesitated. "Counterintelligence," I said. "How did you know?" "He would have made sure you ended up somewhere you could take care of yourself," the colonel said. He wasn't smiling when he said it. He was stating a fact. I didn't know what to say to that. "Your grandfather was part of a unit that doesn't appear in any official army documentation," the colonel continued. "I want to be careful about what I say here because some of it is still restricted. But you're wearing his coin and you have clearance and you deserve to know something about who he was." I waited. There were reconnaissance operations along the Laotian border in the early 1970s. Not all of them were official. Some of them were run by very small teams, 4, 5 men under arrangements that didn't get documented in the standard chain of command. He looked at the coin in my hand. That coin was issued to the men on those teams. It wasn't a medal. It wasn't a commendation. It was a marker. It meant the person carrying it had been read into operations that the government needed to be able to deny. "Things that never officially happened," I said. He looked at me carefully. "Exactly." I thought about Grandpa Walt watching the road from his porch. I thought about the way he changed the subject when I asked about Vietnam. I thought about the old friend who appeared at the back of the church and left before I could speak to him. "My family thought he never did anything worth knowing," I said. The colonel's expression shifted. Not anger, something older than anger. The men on those teams saved lives, intelligence assets, people who would have been executed if they hadn't been extracted. Some of them had families. Those families are alive today. He paused. "Walt was responsible for 3 separate extractions that I know of, possibly more. Why wasn't he recognized?" I asked. "Because recognizing him would have meant acknowledging what happened, and acknowledging what happened would have had diplomatic consequences that the government wasn't prepared to manage." He folded his hands on the table. "So the men were thanked privately, given their coins, and released back into civilian life. With nothing," I said. "With their lives," he said. "Which was more than some of them expected to come back with." I sat with that for a moment. "My parents said he was withdrawn," I told the colonel. "They said he was difficult. They acted like his whole life was a kind of failure." "I know," he said. And the way he said it made me think he had heard this about other men he had known, men he had watched return to families who couldn't see them. "Why did he keep the coin?" I asked. The colonel looked at it one more time. "Same reason they all kept them," he said. "So they could remember they were real, so they could hold something in their hands and know that what they did happened, even if no one else would ever say so." I thought about Grandpa Walt in his kitchen with the landline telephone and the weather radio and the tomatoes that grew better than anyone could explain. I thought about the way he gripped my hand at my graduation with both of his and said I already knew how. I understood something then that I hadn't before. He hadn't been hiding from his life. He had been protecting something larger than himself for so long that the habit had become the man. And my family had looked at the silence and decided it was emptiness. They were wrong. I left the ceremony and drove back to Maynardville. I don't know exactly why I think I needed to be in his house again, with what I now knew. I let myself in with the key I still had. The house was cold. The casserole from the churchwoman was long gone. The tomato plants in the garden were brown from November. I sat in his kitchen chair at his kitchen table, and I put the coin in front of me, and I thought about everything the colonel had told me. Then I thought about my mother's voice when she said something so small. I called her that night. I didn't plan the conversation. I just started talking. I told her what the colonel had told me. I told her about the coin, about the unit, about the extractions, about the families alive today who didn't know Walter Briggs's name. I told her about the 3 seconds the colonel had closed his eyes when he heard Grandpa Walt's name spoken out loud. She was quiet for a long time. "That can't be right," she finally said. "He never mentioned any of that." "That's the point, Mom," I said. "He couldn't." "But why wouldn't he at least?" She stopped. "Because you never wanted to hear it," I said. Not unkindly, just truthfully. I think he tried, once. I think he saw how it landed. And then he stopped trying. Another long silence. "He asked me once," she said slowly, "to come down for Thanksgiving. I told him we had plans with your father's family." She paused. "He just said okay. He didn't argue. He didn't make me feel guilty." "No," I said. "He wouldn't have." She didn't say anything for a while. When she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, careful, like someone handling something they weren't sure how to hold. "I thought he was choosing to be alone," she said. "I told myself that for years. That he was the kind of man who preferred it." "I know," I said. "But he wasn't, was he?" "No," I said. "He was the kind of man who had learned how to survive it." I heard her breath on the other end of the line. Then I heard her crying, quietly, the way people cry when they've been holding something for a very long time. I drove to Nashville the following weekend. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up with the coin and a copy of the photograph from the VFW post, the one the men there had shown me. Grandpa Walt in 1971, 26 years old, standing in front of a Jeep somewhere very green, squinting into the sun. Someone had written Walt B. on the back in pencil. No date, no location. My father answered the door. He looked at me the way he sometimes did, like he wasn't sure what kind of visit this was going to be. I sat down at their kitchen table. My mother was already there, and I could tell from her face that she had not slept well. I placed the coin in the center of the table. I placed the photograph beside it. My father looked at both of them without touching either. Then he looked at me. I told him what I knew. All of it, the way I'd told my mother on the phone, but in person, at his table, with the coin between us. I told him about the border operations, about the deniability, about the assets who came home because of 5 men who left no record of being there. My father is not an emotional man. He processes things at a distance, through logic and practicality. I have watched him deliver bad news without flinching. I have watched him make hard decisions without visible regret. When I finished talking, he picked up the photograph. He looked at it for a long time, the young man squinting into the sun. 26 years old, before the long porch and the sagging boards and the flannel shirts. "I told him once," my father said slowly, "that he needed to stop living in the past, that whatever happened over there, he needed to put it down and move forward." He set the photograph down carefully. He didn't say anything back. He just looked at me. My father's jaw tightened. I thought he was being stubborn. "He was being kind," I said. My father nodded. "Just once," but I saw it. My brother came over that evening. They had called him after I arrived. He sat across from me and looked at the coin and the photograph and didn't say much. Then he said, "He called me once. About 3 years ago. He said he wasn't feeling well and asked if I could come down for a weekend." He stopped. I told him I'd try. I never went. He looked at the table. "I figured if it was serious, someone would tell me," he said. I didn't say anything to that. I didn't need to. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over my brother's. They sat like that for a minute. The kitchen was very quiet. Finally, my father said, "Can we do something?" "For him?" He looked at me. "I know we can't undo it. But is there something we can do?" I thought about that. I said there was. It took 2 months to arrange. I contacted the colonel again. He put me in touch with 2 other men who had served in the same unit, one in Arizona, one in North Carolina. Both of them had known Grandpa Walt. One of them, a man named James, said he had tried to find him after discharge and lost the trail. He had thought Walt was dead. We organized a small gathering at the VFW post in Maynardville. Not a ceremony, no speeches, no flags, no formal anything. Just a room with chairs, a table with food, and people who had known Walter Briggs. The 2 men from the unit came. The colonel came. Mrs. Patton came. the men from the post who had known him in town. My mother, my father, my brother, with his wife and the kids, who were old enough to sit still and sense that something important was happening. The man named James brought a photograph I had never seen. 5 men in a jungle clearing, none of them smiling, all of them carrying themselves the way people carry themselves when they have been through something that stripped away everything unnecessary. Grandpa Walt was second from the left. He looked like someone I knew, and also someone I was meeting for the first time. James stood up and said some words I won't try to reproduce exactly. He talked about what those men did and what it cost them and why they didn't talk about it. He talked about how Walter Briggs had carried a wounded man for 2 kilometers in the dark without making a sound that would give away their position. He talked about 3 names, Vietnamese names, and said those 3 men had families in the United States now, had been here for decades, had grandchildren who were American citizens, and not one of them knew who had gotten them out. My mother was crying before he finished. My father's face was very still in the way that meant he was working hard to keep it that way. My brother's oldest kid, who was 9, tugged on his sleeve and whispered something. My brother leaned down. The kid whispered again. Later, my brother told me what the kid had asked. He had asked, "Is great-grandpa a hero?" And my brother had said, "Yes." And the kid had said, "How come we didn't know?" My brother didn't have an answer for that. He said he just held the kid's hand for a while. After the gathering, my parents drove out to the cemetery. I went with them. The headstone was already there. I had chosen something simple. His name, his dates, beloved grandfather. Nothing about Vietnam, nothing about service, because that was how he would have wanted it. What he did had never been about being seen. We stood there in the cold for a while. The cemetery was quiet. A crow was doing something in one of the oak trees at the far edge of the property. My father said, "I spent my whole life thinking strength looked like having something to show for it." He was looking at the headstone. He had the most to show for it of anyone I've ever known, and he never showed any of it. My mother said, "I'm sorry, Dad." She said it out loud, to the headstone, to the cold air, to whatever might still be listening. I'm sorry I didn't look closer. I held the coin in my hand. It had been warm from my pocket. I turned it over once, the eagle on one side and the numbers on the other. The strange compass rose that wasn't quite a compass rose. I didn't place it on the grave. I thought about it. But then I thought about what the colonel had said, that they kept them so they could hold something and know it happened. I thought that if Grandpa Walt had wanted the coin to rest in a cemetery, he would have arranged that. He was a man who arranged things carefully. He had put it in a shoebox under a flannel shirt in a closet he knew I would eventually open. He had left it for me, not for the ground. So I kept it. My family changed after that. The way families change, not all at once. Not cleanly. My mother started talking about him at dinner. Not constantly, not dramatically. Just the way you talk about someone who was real. She framed the photograph of the young man squinting into the sun and put it on the bookshelf in the living room. My father started going to the VFW post once a month when he was in the area, just to sit with the older men and listen. He said he was trying to get better at listening. My brother drove to Maynardville one Sunday with his kids. No occasion. He just wanted them to see the house, the porch, the garden where the tomatoes grew improbably well. He called me afterward and said his oldest had stood on the porch for a long time, looking at the road, and then asked if they could come back in the summer. Yes, my brother had said. They could absolutely come back. I think about Grandpa Walt a lot now. I think about the things he chose not to say and the things he chose not to ask for. I think about how my family looked at his silence and saw absence, when what was actually there was discipline, decades of it. The kind you develop when you understand that the work matters more than the recognition. I think about what James said at the gathering. That the hardest operations are the ones where your name is not attached to the outcome. That you do the thing, and then you come home, and you eat breakfast, and you fix the truck, and you grow the tomatoes, and you live your life as if the thing never happened. And if someone asks, you say that was a long time ago and you hand them a glass of sweet tea. That is not a simple life. That is a particular kind of courage that most people will never be asked to demonstrate. My family was asked to see it, and they didn't. I was almost one of them. The coin stays in my left jacket pocket now. Not because I want to be asked about it, but because I want to remember what I almost missed. How close I came to inheriting my family's version of him, the withdrawn man, the peculiar one, the one who didn't try hard enough. How close I came to letting that become the whole story. I am still in the army. I still believe in structure and discipline, and the value of work that doesn't need an audience. But I have changed one thing about how I move through my days. I pay closer attention to the quiet people, the ones who don't speak first in a room, the ones who finish what they start without announcing it, the ones who help without making the help about themselves. Because I have learned that silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is the shape that sacrifice takes when it has no other option. Sometimes it is the form that love takes in people who cannot afford to ask for anything in return. My grandfather lived a whole life in that shape, and my family nearly let it disappear without ever understanding what it was. I was not going to let that happen. Not to him, not to his memory, not to the 3 families in this country who don't know his name but are here because of him. I carry the coin, and I carry the knowledge, and I carry him forward the only way I know how, quietly. The way he taught me, which is to say without ever teaching me at all. If you have listened to this and felt something familiar, if there is someone in your life who sits at the edge of the room and doesn't ask for much and has never once explained themselves to you, please go find out who they are, while you still can. Don't wait for a colonel to go still at a table. Don't wait for a shoebox in a closet. Don't wait for the moment when you are standing in a cold cemetery wishing you had paid closer attention. The quiet ones are right there. They are waiting, in their patient way, for someone to simply look. Thank you for being here.